Good day. Over the course of the last few hours, Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, has provided details, or at least some sketchy details, which signify or signal the extent of Russia's military deployments on its border with Ukraine. And the comments that Shoigu made, by the way, he did so in Severomorsk, which is an Arctic base of the Russian Navy, far away from this, from the area of conflict. But the scale of the deployments that Shoigu confirmed are not only on a far greater scale than anyone imagined, or at least than had been reported up to now, but they also give serious food for thought. Now, this is how these deployments are reported on Russia's defense ministries, on the Russian Defense Ministry's website. This is how the Defense Ministry reports Shoigu's words. Within 3 weeks, 2 armies and 3 formations of the airborne troops were successfully transferred to the western borders of the Russian Federation in the areas of performing combat training tasks. Sergei Shoigu said that as part of the control classes for the winter training period, checks of combat readiness of the troops would take place in the western and southern military districts. Now, the western and southern military districts are obviously the ones which border Ukraine. And here we learn that the total number of forces which have been redeployed to this region are 2 armies and 3 formations of the airborne troops. Now, a Russian army is the equivalent of a US Army Corps. It consists of several divisions, and we are told that there are, in fact, 2 of them deployed in this area. We don't know the size of these armies, or indeed, and of course, Shoigu doesn't clarify which armies have been deployed, but this is on the face of it a very large force indeed. Note also that it includes airborne troops, 3 formations of airborne troops. We again don't know exactly what the scale of these formations are, but the Russians have several airborne divisions, paratroop divisions, and they also have a certain number of independent airborne brigades, forces that can be airdropped, parachuted behind the enemy's lines and can engage in activities there. And we've actually been receiving further reports from other sources. Firstly, Yulia Mendel, who is Zelensky's spokesman, said in an interview with Reuters, the same interview which I discussed in a previous video, that there are 90,000 troops now deployed by Russia along Ukraine's borders, 50,000 along the border with Donbass, 40,000 in Crimea. That would be consistent with the scale of the deployments that Shoigu is talking about. We have also learnt that there are apparently field hospitals being cited. This is unconfirmed, but it's plausible. If it's true, then it means that this is in fact a combat force and that the Russians are prepared for casualties and presumably fighting. And it seems that there are also ballistic missiles deployed with this force, which would presumably be Iskander missiles. These are medium and long-range missiles, which suggests that there are plans to take out Ukrainian base areas in the event of a Russian offensive or counteroffensive. Last but not least, we learned from the OSCE, or at least there are reports that the OSCE is saying that GPS no longer works, or it's no longer working well in the territory along the ceasefire line, and presumably this is a consequence of Russian jamming, or at least the beginnings of Russian jamming. Russia, incidentally, is exceptionally advanced in jamming technology. The United States and NATO were apparently astonished by the extent of it during the previous fighting in Ukraine in 2014. And if that were to recur again, it would go far beyond simply jamming GPS signals. So this is a very large and very powerful force redeployed by Russia within the space of 3 weeks. And that time limit, that time frame which Shoigu has indicated, is itself indicative. Because, of course, as I have discussed many times in many programs on this channel, the event which precipitated this large-scale Russian deployment, a fact entirely ignored by Western governments and by the Western media, was the previous very large deployment of Ukrainian forces along the contact line. I say that because that deployment of Ukrainian forces began at the beginning of March, and Shoigu is saying in the middle of April that the Russian deployments took place over the previous 3 weeks. So they clearly happened in response to the Ukrainian deployment. And they did so on a scale that appears to have astonished the Ukrainians and alarmed Western governments, including, of course, the government of the United States. Now, along the way, there have been further comments by various Russian officials over the course of the last few hours. The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, has warned the United States to keep its 2 destroyers that are going to enter the Black Sea well away from Crimea and well away from the Russian coast. He has reminded the United States that Russia is in a position to respond to those destroyers if they take any step which Russia deems threatening. He is hinting quite obviously at the presence of batteries of supersonic anti-ship missiles which the Russians have deployed in Crimea and which they have previously indicated that they would be prepared to use in the event of close deployment of US naval ships to areas which the Russians consider to be militarily sensitive. There's also been a large number of comments and discussions on Russian programs on Russian national television. Now, these, I should say, can be sometimes fairly passionate and fairly heated, and there have been some apparently rather strong remarks about the need for Russia to deal with Ukraine once and for all. In fact, some of these comments have been so strong that the Kremlin has issued a statement via its spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, that these statements should not be taken entirely seriously. They reflect the opinions of those who say them. They do not reflect Russia's opinions, and that the policy of Russia remains that it wants a de-escalation of the situation in eastern Ukraine and a ceasefire, or rather a return to the ceasefire there. So that's the Russian side. Now, over the course of the last few hours, there's also been a statement by the core group of the Western alliance, the US and its closest allies in the so-called G7 group. And I'm going to read out this statement in full. We, the G7 foreign ministers of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America, and the High Representative of the European Union, are deeply concerned by the large ongoing build-up of Russian military forces on Ukraine's border and in illegally annexed Crimea. These large-scale troop movements, without prior notification, represent threatening and destabilizing activities. We call on Russia to cease its provocations and to immediately de-escalate tensions in line with its international obligations. In particular, we call on Russia to uphold the OSCE principles and commitments that it has signed up to on transparency of military movements and to respond to the procedure established under Chapter 3 of the Vienna document. Recalling our last statement of 18th March, we reaffirm our unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We support Ukraine's posture of restraint. We underline our strong appreciation and continued support for France's and Germany's efforts through the Normandy 4 process to secure the full implementation of the Minsk agreements, which is the only way forward for a lasting political solution to the conflict. We call on all sides to engage constructively in the Trilateral Contact Group on the OSCE's proposals to confirm and consolidate the ceasefire. Now, on the face of it, that is a very interesting statement because it manages or tries to satisfy every side. On the one hand, you have some language which appears to support Ukraine. There is, for example, that reference to illegally annexed Crimea and to talk of the Russian deployment as threatening and destabilizing and the call on Russia to cease its provocations. Though it's not clear at the moment what those provocations are, because when you unpack the paragraph in which there is that talk of provocations, it turns out that the only real objection the West has, or at least the only legal objection the West has to that Russian deployment, is that the Western powers weren't notified of it in advance. I would read again the exact words. These large-scale troop movements without prior notification represent threatening and destabilizing activities. We call on Russia to uphold the OSCE principles and commitments that it has signed up to on transparency of military movements and to respond to the procedure established under Chapter 3 of the Vienna document. So presumably, if the Russians had informed the Western powers in advance that they were going to deploy 2 armies and 3 airborne forces and ballistic missiles and who knows how much aviation to the border of Ukraine, that wouldn't be provocative or escalatory. It would be fine. Well, I mean, that is nonsense. And one has to also recall that Ukraine, for its part, does not seem to have complied with the transparency obligations when it deployed its forces to the contact line in March. Anyway, let's get away from that and focus instead on the actual key parts of this statement, all of which are contained in the last 2 paragraphs. Firstly, there's the penultimate paragraph. Recalling our last statement of 18th March, we reaffirm our unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Now, that actually, if you think about this, is an attempt to reconcile the American position with the German and French one. The United States talks all the time about its unwavering support for Ukraine. The Europeans, the Germans and the French, talk about their support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. As I have pointed out previously in other programs, the reference to internationally recognized borders implicitly concedes the possibility that as a result of international negotiations, Ukraine's borders might one day be changed. Conceivably, if everybody agrees to this, Crimea, for example, might be one day recognized as part of Russia. So this is, of course, completely contrary to the US position, thus the reference earlier in the statement to illegally annexed Crimea, but it is an attempt in this paragraph to reconcile these two ultimately divergent positions. And then, of course, we have this very strange sentence, very short, very strange sentence. We support Ukraine's posture of restraint. If Ukraine is indeed facing aggression, why does it need to be advised to show restraint? Restraint suggests, on the contrary, that the Western powers don't fully trust Ukraine and worry that Ukraine might do something on its eastern border, which the Western powers would be extremely unhappy to see. It is, in effect, a request, or perhaps I should say a plea to Ukraine to give up any idea of launching an offensive in eastern Ukraine, which would only result in its comprehensive military defeat and which would cause the United States and the other Western allies enormous embarrassment, loss of face, and trouble. And then we come to the key paragraph, which is the last one. We underline our strong appreciation and continued support for France's and Germany's efforts through the Normandy process to secure the full implementation of the Minsk agreements, which is the only way forward for a lasting political solution to the conflict. Now, the key point to understand about this is that it is the Russians who repeatedly bring the topic back to the Minsk agreements and who require its full implementation. The key point about the Minsk agreements is that they require Ukraine to enter into direct negotiations with the leaders of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. There's been some attempt from time to time by some Western governments to suggest a change of sequencing, whereby first Ukraine regains control of its border with Russia, and then it talks with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. But the Russians will have none of that, and they have pointed out absolutely correctly that the Minsk agreement makes clear what the proper sequencing is. First, the talks between the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and only after those talks have taken place, only after there is a full constitutional settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, then and only then will Ukraine be allowed to regain control of its eastern border. That is what the Minsk agreement says. It is the Russians who insist on its full implementation. It is Ukraine which has been refusing to implement it, as it says that it will never talk to the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And yet here we see in this G7 statement that reference to the full implementation of the Minsk agreements as the only way forward for a lasting political solution to the conflict. In effect, this G7 statement incorporates within itself Russian language and the Russian proposed solution to the Ukrainian crisis. It does so by appearing to support Ukraine, but on the substance, it adopts the Russian position. And then, of course, it ends with these words. We call on all sides, note again the reference to all sides, that includes Ukraine, to engage constructively in the trilateral contact group on the OSCE's proposals to confirm and consolidate the ceasefire. So that says that the Western powers want the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine to be preserved, and by calling on all sides to engage constructively in the Trilateral Contact Group to confirm and consolidate the ceasefire, once again, they are hinting that Ukraine has not been acting constructively and effectively, and has in effect been undermining the ceasefire. So this G7 statement is in fact a strange document, so strange that in some ways I'm going to come back to it later at the conclusion of this broadcast. But at the same time, it appears to support Ukraine, and like so many other Western statements, it actually says that Ukraine should comply with the agreement that it made and which was essentially brokered by the Russians, which requires it to engage in talks with the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, which up to now Ukraine has consistently refused to do. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we see the Ukrainians coming under extreme pressure. Apparently, they made a request for Patriot missile batteries to be deployed to Ukraine. That is, by the way, logistically impossible. Even if Patriot missile batteries were sent to Ukraine, actually activating them and bringing them to a combat-ready position would take time. And in the meantime, they would be desperately vulnerable to any Russian strikes. Anyway, that suggestion has apparently been refused, and apparently a request by Ukraine again for its membership to be fast-tracked was rebuffed, with Secretary Blinken saying that the United States, or rather he, might look into that one day. Those are his words. So Ukraine, its pleas for Western support continue to go unanswered. Pressure on it from the Western powers to comply with the ceasefire is mounting, and we see the kind of comments that the Ukrainians are now making. And here I'm going to go to a statement, a report by the Russian news agency TASS. I accept that it is a Russian news agency, perhaps not the most sympathetic to the Ukrainian position, but it quotes a Ukrainian official, Alexei Danilov, the secretary of Ukraine's very powerful National Security and Defense Council, and I've no reason to think the TASS is misrepresenting his statements or is mistranslating his quote. This is what Danilov is reported to have said, according to TASS. Ukraine wants to settle the conflict in Donbass by political and diplomatic means and has no plans to regain control of its eastern territories by military means, but it is ready for possible escalation of the situation in this region, Alexei Danilov, Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, said on Tuesday at a meeting with EU ambassadors. Today, Ukraine has no plans to regain control over temporarily occupied territories by military means. Our task is to settle the conflict solely by political and diplomatic means. Then it goes on to say that Danilov thanked European partners for support to Ukraine and stressed the importance of such assistance. It will be difficult for us without assistance from our real partners. Ukraine is ready to respond to the threats emerging near its borders. So despite the brave words in the last part of the sentence, effectively Danilov says that without Western support, Ukraine cannot stand up to Russia. And given the enormous pressure that's coming from the Western powers for the ceasefire, the Ukraine itself accepts that a ceasefire there must be. Now, what does all this mean? Why are we in this bizarre situation? Firstly, I come back to what I said at the beginning of this program. The Russian build-up on Ukraine's eastern borders is enormous, and it is such that if this huge force were indeed unleashed on Ukraine, it's impossible to imagine that Ukraine's military would survive for more than a short time. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has spoken about a war in eastern Ukraine, if it were to be started by Ukraine, ending in Ukraine's destruction. And given the size of this force, one can see why he would say that. Moreover, it's absolutely clear that the Western powers have no military options in this situation. The two destroyers that have gone to the Black Sea are going to patrol the Black Sea, but they're not going to achieve anything very much. Suggestions of fast-tracking Ukraine into NATO have been rebuffed. They're certainly not going to, the NATO is certainly not going to provoke the Russians by doing that, leading to an attack on Ukraine, which would end in Ukraine's defeat and which might expose NATO as a paper tiger, and the possibility of the deployment of Western forces to Ukraine is categorically ruled out. They too would risk being overwhelmed by the immensely powerful force the Russians have deployed. There's been some talk about sanctions, and people like Manfred Weber, who is the head of the European Workers' Party in the European Parliament, has talked again about sanctions, and he's spoken about disconnecting Russia from SWIFT and such things. The Russian response to all of that is bring it on. The Russians, over the course of the last few hours, have said that in the event of a conflict, they expect to be disconnected from SWIFT. They expect to be disconnected from Western payment systems. They anticipate that Visa and MasterCard will no longer work in Russia, and they're prepared to take all that on the chin. They now have their own debit card, the so-called Mir card, and they have their own backup to SWIFT, and they are fully prepared for any disconnection of that nature. So sanctions doesn't appear to be taking the West very far. So in this situation, the Western powers, as that fascinating statement from the G7 shows, are trying desperately to bolster the ceasefire, but to do so in a way that will save both their face and Ukraine's face. Because, of course, the risk they run is that if Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, simply orders Ukraine's army to retreat from the eastern Ukraine, to move away from eastern Ukraine, if the ceasefire is simply reimposed as it was, Zelensky might find himself in very severe political difficulties in Ukraine itself, with the appearance of him having, as we say in Britain, led his troops up the hill and down again without anything being achieved in the process. Also, of course, the West itself doesn't want to disclose the lack of cards it has to play. It has to at least give the appearance that it is pushing for a negotiated or at least a phased withdrawal of both sides from this conflict line in a way that will save Ukraine's face and which will save the West's own face. And that explains ultimately, in my opinion, that extraordinarily convoluted statement we got from the G7. What they're basically saying in that statement is this: please, Russia, don't escalate, don't actually take any action that might destroy Ukraine. That would be very bad and very terrible for us. We accept that there has to be a negotiated settlement of the conflict on the basis that you've always said, the Minsk agreement. And if you just give us time and help us to protect us from losing face, we will see what we can do in order to achieve that. In the meantime, you can trust us to restrain Ukraine from doing anything reckless. We come back to that fascinating short sentence in that statement: we support Ukraine's posture of restraint. Support Ukraine's posture of restraint when Ukraine has shown no actual restraint, or perhaps more accurately and properly, are urging Ukraine to show restraint, as the rest of our statement shows. The rest of our statement, when we call on all sides to engage constructively in the trilateral contact group. So it's a desperate plea to the Russians, if you like, to show some mercy. Well, will the Russians do it? Well, the answer is probably yes. But I suspect that they will do it along the way, insisting upon some actual positive movement in implementing the Minsk agreement. That, after all, is what Putin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was saying the other day. And again, this statement essentially, this G7 statement essentially says the same. We underline our strong appreciation and continued support for France's and Germany's efforts through the Normandy process to secure the full implementation of the Minsk agreements, which is the only way forward for a lasting political solution to the conflict. And unsurprisingly, in the face of all this, in the face of what you might say is a situation very close, if not to checkmate, at least to something like that, we learned that President Biden has himself spoken to Vladimir Putin and has even suggested a summit meeting between the two to try and thrash all those things out. I'm going to deal with that conversation in another program, which I'm going to do shortly. But there it is. Whatever was being planned in February and March by the deployment of all these troops to eastern Ukraine by Ukraine, it has worked out horribly. The Russian reaction has been catastrophically underestimated, and the Western powers, and indeed Ukraine itself, are now scrambling to find a way out of the pit they've dug themselves into without humiliation and disastrous loss of face. They want, in other words, to be able to say once again to their populations that there was no actual attempt to do anything by Ukraine in eastern Ukraine, but it was the unity of the West and its support for Ukraine that deterred the Russians from the terrible aggression that they were planning. We will see what price the Russians exact in return for allowing the West to retain its face in that sort of way. As for the danger of war in eastern Ukraine, in my opinion, it's not completely disappeared. There is still a risk that someone might do something completely reckless. That is what the words like "we support Ukraine's posture of restraint" show the West is worried about. We saw Alexei Danilov's comments to the EU ambassadors about Ukraine not seeking a military solution. Clearly, there is worry and nervousness in the West that the Ukrainians are not fully under control. And indeed, the risk that they might do something reckless and foolish that could bring disaster upon themselves and humiliation for the West is always there. As some people indeed pointed out, when Zelensky toured the battlefield or prospective battlefield in his flak jacket, some Ukrainian troops, presumably from one of the far-right battalions that have been incorporated in the Ukrainian army, actually unfurled an old battle flag used by the Germans, or at least parts of the German military, during the Second World War, or some sort of battle flag that resembled it. So there are some people in this in this region, who might in fact do something reckless and precipitate. I have to say, I don't think that is at all likely. I think that the weight of Western pressure on Ukraine to pull back is now so strong that, as Danilov said to the EU ambassadors, that is what Ukraine is going to do. The entire diplomacy from this point on is to try to achieve that while saving Zelensky's political skin and the West's face. Thank you for joining me for this long, extended program on this channel. Please check out also our other channels, our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, Odyssey, and the rest. Please support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Please also go to our Discord server, check out our shop. You'll find links under this video. Thank you for enduring me for this long and complicated video on this tangled subject, and have a wonderful day, and I look forward to you joining me on future programs on this channel.